Hello, friends, and welcome to this episode of the History Revolution podcast. This week, we get to explore founding father Thomas Jefferson. But before you start this podcast, please go to thehistoryrevolution.com/Jefferson for your free podcast companion. Now let's get started. Thomas Jefferson is one of the most interesting and most studied of the founding fathers. He is also one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented by modern historians and history teachers. Jefferson was born April 13th, 1743, on his father's plantation in the Piedmont region of central Virginia. He was the third of 10 children. His father, Peter, became very successful even though he was a self-taught man. He placed a high value on the education for his own children. Thomas had tutors and was enrolled in schools run by local churches. Peter, his father, would die when Thomas was only 14 years old. At this time, Thomas inherited around 5,000 acres of his father Peter's estate. Thomas would go on to attend the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia at the age of 16. While in Williamsburg, he would be exposed to the ideas of Christian Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Sir Isaac Newton, who Jefferson referred to as the three greatest men the world had ever produced. He spent 5 years studying the law with his mentor, George Wythe, who was one of the preeminent scholars in Virginia at the time. After 5 years with his mentor, he left Williamsburg and began practicing law. In 1769, Jefferson was elected to the Virginia state legislature known as the House of Burgesses. Jefferson's time in the House of Burgesses would help shape and cement his desire for independence from Great Britain. It was also during this time that he began conveying his own ideas of the natural rights of man and personal freedom. In Jefferson's mind, this also included slaves, and he proposed reforming slavery in Virginia. In 1768, Jefferson began construction of his famous home, Monticello. Monticello is an Italian word that means little mountain. Jefferson would tinker with the design of Monticello for the rest of his life, and architecture was one of his great joys. He referred to his ongoing work at Monticello as my essay in architecture. The home is set atop a hill overlooking Jefferson's 5,000-acre estate. The gardens feature both food sources and beautiful flowering plants. Jefferson was inspired by his years in Europe as a foreign minister and basically redesigned the buildings upon his return from Europe. Thomas Jefferson loved his family dearly. Unfortunately, his family was plagued by tragedy. He married his wife Martha, who was a widow, in 1772. She gave him 6 children, but only 2, Martha, known as Patsy, and Mary, known as Polly, survived to adulthood. Martha most likely suffered from diabetes and was in poor health. She died in 1782, several months after the birth of their 6th child. Jefferson was devastated and spent much time in seclusion. He was protective of his children and took Patsy and Polly with him to Europe when he was a minister to France. Jefferson never remarried after the death of his wife Martha, devoting so much time to his country and public service. By 1774, it was becoming abundantly clear that the relationship between Great Britain and the American colonies was beyond repair. Although Jefferson was not a delegate to the First Continental Congress, he did present a summary view of the rights of British America, which listed the grievances the colonies had against King George III following Great Britain's response to the Boston Tea Party. It was a precursor to the Declaration of Independence, and in the summary, he laid out his beliefs on the right of self governance. He also condemned slavery and laid the blame of slavery in America on the crown. The Second Continental Congress met in 1775. The Olive Branch Petition was written and approved by Congress in July of 1775, but King George refused to even read it. The American colonies continued on the inevitable course toward independence. In June of 1776, Thomas Jefferson, along with John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert R. Livingston, and Roger Sherman, began writing the Declaration of Independence. Adams pushed for Jefferson to be the primary author of the Declaration. Jefferson worked on the first draft mostly alone outside of the hours that the Congress was meeting. Jefferson was inspired by his own work in Virginia, George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, and the works of John Locke. His first draft included another condemnation of the slave trade, blaming King George III. The Declaration was debated amongst the committee and the full Congress. The colonies needed to be united in order to defeat Great Britain and pull off one of the greatest upsets of all time. The southern states, specifically South Carolina, would never sign off on such a strong condemnation of slavery. Their economies relied on it. The Declaration was revised, removing the anti-slavery portions. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was ratified by the Continental Congress. It was later signed by the delegates on August 2nd, 1776. Soon after the Declaration of Independence was ratified, Jefferson resigned from the Continental Congress and returned to Virginia. He was reelected to the Virginia legislature, now known as the House of Delegates. It was here that he worked diligently for years to revise Virginia's laws and establish a new Virginia Constitution. Now, many of the bills he worked so hard on, like disestablishing the Anglican Church as the official state church, did not pass. However, he laid the groundwork for those that came behind him, like James Madison, to pass laws on religious freedom. He would later serve as Virginia governor and move the capital from Williamsburg to Richmond. During the Revolutionary War, the British attempted to capture or kill the Founding Fathers. In 1781, the traitor Benedict Arnold led a British invasion of Virginia. Jefferson and others fled Richmond to the west. General Charles Cornwallis also sent cavalry forces commanded by Banastre Tarleton to capture Jefferson and other Virginia leaders at Montello. Fortunately, the Virginia militia was able to stop the British plan. After the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, ending the Revolutionary War, Thomas Jefferson was sent by Congress to join Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in France to negotiate with Great Britain and France on behalf of the United States of America. Franklin would soon retire, and Jefferson was appointed to succeed him as Minister of France. He would spend 5 years in France, playing a pivotal role in shaping the young country's initial foreign policy. After his return from France, he became the United States of America's very first Secretary of State under President George Washington. Jefferson was an anti-federalist who preferred individual freedom and states' rights over a strong central or federal government. During his time in Washington's cabinet, Jefferson would constantly fight with fellow Federalist cabinet member, Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and Federalist Vice President John Adams. He and Adams, who had been such close friends, had now become bitter political rivals. Jefferson and Hamilton would fight over the direction of the country financially. Hamilton wanted the federal government to take on all of the individual state debts, as well as start a federal bank to issue credit to the states. Jefferson vehemently opposed this policy. Another fight between them was the permanent location of the new country's capital. Hamilton wanted the capital to be in the Northeast, closer to the major commercial centers of New York and Boston. Jefferson and others, like James Madison, supported it being further south. The infighting continued until they were able to strike the Compromise of 1790. The federal government would take on the state's debts, but the capital would be on the Potomac River between Virginia and Maryland. Jefferson would resign as Secretary of State in 1793 and return to Montello. He did not like the direction the country was taking with the development of political parties, financial policy, and seemingly choosing to align politically and financially with Great Britain instead of France. Thank you again, friends, for watching and listening to the History Revolution podcast. Remember, go to thehistoryrevolution.com/Jefferson to download your free podcast companion. God bless you, and see you again next week.